Welcome to Feeling Beings Who Think, a podcast project that seeks to find wisdom in conversation through the stories and personal reflections of regular people like you and me. My name is Erin Rice, and I'm really grateful you're here. So let's get started. At the end of the conversation that you are about to hear, I say that I can't wait to listen to this one again. And that's thanks to my guest, Erin Weber-Johnson. She and I covered such an expansive ground of topics, and it prompted so many thoughts and feelings. We talked about things like experiencing vulnerability at work these days, how hard it is to just take care of ourselves sometimes, and the courageous conversations that we have to have when we know it's important that we do so. We talked about how our lives surprise us and also how our lives disappoint us. And sometimes that means doing some intense and hard grief work. And sometimes it's okay that life's a disappointment because you know what? The expectations that we place on ourselves, sometimes they're just too much. We also talked about faith a bit, which is starting to be a theme that I wasn't entirely sure would happen. And I admit to a real fear that I have been coming up against in this podcast project with every conversation. And that has to do with a desire to talk about all the feeling beings who think in Scripture, in the stories that I've been saturated in for quite some time, and stories that I think a lot of us are saturated in. And I think there's something important around that for me to pay attention to. And Erin thankfully put some beautiful, clarifying language around that for me. And I'm thinking a little bit more about it. And I also want to give a heads up that there are two difficult topics in this conversation. We both talk about suicide and how we have loved ones who have ended their lives. And Erin shares part of her story, which was experiencing a miscarriage. I really believe that you and I support each other when we take time for conversations that intentionally discuss these experiences in our lives, and also when we share these stories with each other. And I also believe that you and I need to be mindful of what conversations and stories are best for us to take in at certain times in our lives. So please know that. Now, if you need to pause this conversation periodically and ruminate just a bit over something Erin says, I would not be surprised. She is gracious with what I would call connecting the dots, utilizing her knowledge and experience to put words around deep wisdom in new ways. She, to me, embodies practical theology. She is someone who seeks to make real what she thinks and feels about questions of ultimate meaning. I'm going to close with just a little bit of Erin's bio. She is a senior consultant at Vandersall Collective, which is a faith-based, women-led consulting firm. In 2017, she co-founded the Collective Foundation, which worked to address the gap in giving characteristics in faith communities of color. In 2022, she co-founded the Belonging Project, a movement designed to reimagine belonging across the ecclesial landscape. And by the way, ecclesial is a lovely academic fancy term for denomination or church. Erin is also a published author. Her co-edited book, Crisis and Care, Meditations on Faith and Philanthropy, is available through Cascade Books. And we do talk about that book a little bit towards the end of our conversation. Okay, that's it. I hope you find this time as rich as I did. Thanks again for listening, and thanks, hopefully, for sharing what you're listening to. Hey, Erin Weber-Johnson.
Well, hey, Erin, how are you?
I am doing great.
Good.
I am glad to see you. I am glad that Facebook and this podcast reconnected us after a long time.
Yes, indeed. You know, I was really excited about your invitation to join today because when I saw your podcast, I was really thrilled, first of all, that the conversation that you have been having with others and inviting people into is happening. I think it's a really important one. but also because I hold you in a lot of esteem, I was like, oh, this is the right person to be having these kind of conversations. So I was so excited when you invited me. I was like, yes, let's go. Let's have a conversation, Erin.
Well, thank you. And let that serve as an invitation to others of you, especially some of our familiar colleagues out there in the world. One of the joys of seminary was meeting so many incredible people. Right?
I agree. Yeah, absolutely.
And then you have to leave.
Yeah, and the joy of intentional community, one that, you know, always comes with its learnings, and at the same time, once you no longer have that level of intentional community, man, I miss it. I miss it
too. Maybe that's, you know, before I press record, I'll say that I said to Erin, sometimes I feel a little unsure how to start these conversations because I want them to be intentional. We have limited time. There's so much to talk about. And so I want to dive right in. And then I'm like, are some of these things just too much? But let's just start there with intentional community, because either I'd forgotten or hadn't known that you were from an evangelical background.
Indeed. Yeah.
And I don't know exactly what brought you to seminary. So maybe you want to tell us a little bit about why you were at General Theological Seminary. With most of us who were there, we were there to get ordained to become priests. And that's not why you were there. So maybe I'll let you start with that.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So I am the daughter of an American Baptist minister. And so my family, we moved up and down the Midwest quite a bit. And I met my husband actually at a conservative liberal arts college, and where there was a religion department that was a little bit countercultural to the subculture that was taking place there, where they were really inviting some deep theological conversation and quietly handed us some books of common prayer to check out in the midst of all of the praise and worship that was taking place. And after that, my husband and I, we were married, and we started to look for our own place where we could ask questions and really wrestle with the answers and be able to live in the tension of the I don't know. And we found the Episcopal Church in Seattle, and it became home. So I like to say we found Jesus in the Episcopal Church. And my husband was exploring a call to the ordained ministry. And I was a bit resistant. Having grown up in some difficult situations as a pastor's kid, I knew I did not come with any type of idealized notion of what the church would be. I was pretty clear of what it, not only what it was, but what it was when it was at its worst. And so I did a really good job of postponing his desire to go to seminary. But you know, when you love someone and you can see that they are meant to do something, and I could see that he was so unhappy not living into something that brought him life, right? This idea of vocation, that we started to go through, both of us, the discernment process actually for the priesthood and through our church. And through that process, he became clear of his call, and I became clear as well of my call, which was I wanted to serve the church, but just not in an ordained capacity. I knew early on, 2005, that I was meant to be a part of this thing, whatever it was, whether we wanted to call it a movement or an institution, but that my path was going to look different. So when we were at seminary, my husband was getting his MDiv towards ordination. I was working full time there, so I got to meet.
You were working full time at the seminary.
I was, yes.
That's
I was working.
Right. That's right.
Full time in the academic dean's office, and then I was going to school full time, getting my master's of public administration.
Wow.
Yeah. But the big joke there was it actually started because I knew that if we were going to be in ministry, I needed to take some conflict negotiation courses to best be able to navigate the land. And there I just fell in love with my degree program. And then with whatever free time I had, I would audit classes at the seminary to try and bridge the worlds together for me.
Right. Okay. I want to keep going with this trajectory and story,
No,
but
keep
I
going.
also just really want to circle back to something you said and be intentional about it, because you said something that's beautiful. You said, you know how when you love somebody and you see that something is life-giving, is calling them, and it's not giving them life, to keep denying that call.
Yeah.
So in honesty, I didn't know what that was like then. Because in that relationship in my life, I think I thought I was supposed to know more about what people I loved were supposed to do to make them happy. And I think a lot of us sometimes wrestle with that feeling of in a relationship, knowing that you're meant to help somebody thrive in that way. I don't think everyone is taught that growing up. I don't think everybody sees that in a household growing up. So the fact that you did see that, I want to lift up and say, like, good for you, Erin, because that's I think an emotional capacity and maturity. I mean, it's definitely the foundation of a good marriage and partnership. But good for you for supporting him in that.
And I want to thank you. That's very kind. I also want to acknowledge that he has done quite the same for me. In fact, he's always my biggest champion around.
That's awesome.
Yeah. That's something I very much love about Jared, is that he can see the best version of myself. That he challenges and pushes and encourages me to that. And I think that's something I don't take for granted. Yeah.
That's great. I mean, I think we could get off. I'm not going to get off on this, but I'm just going to say it one more time. And because we reconnected over my conversation with the Reverend Mark Robin Collins, who we both know.
And that was such a great conversation with Mark.
Well, thank you. I agree. Mark is a fountain of wisdom, and I love him so much. And so I'm so grateful we're friends. Okay, now I maybe have forgotten exactly what my point was. No, here's what it was. I know what it was. Okay. One of the things I think that I didn't even understand at seminary, there were some people who came to seminary married. There were some people who got married towards the end of seminary. And you kind of saw, because we were in intentional relationship, intentional community, we spent a lot of time together with people.
Yeah.
It's kind of hard to explain what that might be like in the middle of down Chelsea, Manhattan, but we did. We saw them frequently. And I saw relationships, and I didn't understand sometimes what it was I envied about their relationship. And that sometimes made me mad. Like I couldn't identify all the feelings. But I know that you and Jared, I mean, I remember sensing that from the two of you as a couple, just like a real supportive friendship, partnership, in the two of you.
I think that's really worth paying attention to, because one of the first feelings that I always can recognize when I am at odds with my body or with syncing up is I do feel anger. And it's something just about me that I've started to pay attention to. Others might have a different initial feeling. But so one of the things I've shared with you was, for years, my husband and I were married almost 8 years before we had a child. And for the longest time, anytime I saw someone with a baby, I would just get so angry, especially if they were good mothers. And, like you and Dorothea, like I would get so angry because I felt that as grief. Like that was my first initial feeling was, oh, I want that for me. I'm so sad that I don't think I'm going to be able to have that identity or that relationship in my own life. And so I would, especially in an intentional community where you're all up in each other's and your space and seeing all the dynamics, I remember just being so profoundly jealous and angry and wishing for that myself. Yeah.
I think that's worth definitely spending some time on. The way in which I use anger and have come to realize that what used to be an immediate critical value judgment of somebody else, a criticism of the way something was done. I mean, I think anger came up in that intentional community, in worship.
all the time.
Great.
The intensity with which, and I participated in it and will take full responsibility and own my part, the scrutiny, the way we scrutinized one another, and if this was my experience, may not have been everyone's, the way we scrutinized one another when it came to how worship was done. I mean, for some people, I think it was actually debilitating. It was just so, you had such fear. And then when you leave and you go into a congregation, which of course they care about how worship is done, but they don't care nearly as much as the newbies with the collars on.
Right.
It takes a while to kind of decompress from that reality. And I think some of our anger also came out in classes. I think it definitely sometimes came out in classes in different ways when we didn't understand things. And I think sometimes it's also about the fear. I think most of us were terrified. I'll speak for myself again, about actually leaving and going out into the world. We were terrified about getting jobs. We were terrified about, moving, relocating. I mean, it's stressful when you leave, and then all of a sudden this thing you've been working towards for so long. Okay, go do it. It's like, no, wait, I like being in the before time. And I also, go ahead.
I was going to say, to be able to focus on the minute rather than these grand things.
The minute theology, the minute intellectualism, the minute worship, all of that. Right. And believe me, as a mom, it took a long time for me to have my daughter. And one of my closest friends, we've discussed this many times, we were working together. She had 2 children in the space of time when I was trying to have children. And, it would be anger and it would be weeping. Like, what's going on? Why? What is wrong? It's very, very hard.
It's very hard. And
how did you change? How did you move to this other place, or keep going with what you're going to say? Because I also interrupted you.
No, you're fine. It's a bit of a journey. Do you mind if I share a little bit of my journey?
Please do.
Then I have some thoughts I'd love to think about with you about like what we're facing right now, currently. But when I was there, I was working all the time, and after our second year there on Father's Day, after 8 years of not being able to get pregnant, I had a miscarriage on Father's Day. And I didn't even know what was happening. Like, I had no clue that this was even a thing. I didn't think it was a possibility. And I actually had sent Jared off. It was a Sunday morning. I'd sent Jared off to church to do field placement work, thinking, I'm just going to go to this walk-up, I think it was on 6th Avenue, a walk-up clinic. And then they sent me over to St. Vincent's because they were worried about me. So I went over there, and then Jared joined me. And I remember really going through a lot of grief because I thought, maybe this was my one chance. What if this is my one chance to fulfill this thing, and I'm never going to have that again? And what that of course that sent me into wonderful care and therapy. But I have a beautiful story that comes out of that, which they're not all beautiful. Like, I still carry the pain of that moment. But about 7 or 8 months later, my Jude became known to me. And I think it was October, I realized I was pregnant with Jude. Again, a surprise, because I didn't think this was a possibility. Doctors have been saying very low odds here. And the whole community, we're talking about this intentional community. I think my narrative started to change when people around me allowed me to live into this new narrative with them. And I think that was what changed for me, was seeing how people came around me and loved me and cared for me in the midst of that. So, and I think that's one of the primary pieces of wisdom that I feel like I wish someone had told me when I was younger, was that these new narratives that we own and we claim and we try to live into, whether a new, like a healthier way of being, or a new identity around motherhood, et cetera, like there's no like magic bullet. Like you have to live into it. And that's really hard, right? Like
was part of that like accepting. I mean, if you're telling me that a community embraced you and helped you and carried you into a new narrative, clearly you shared with a certain group of people.
Yeah, it meant sharing very broadly our grief about the loss of my first baby. And then during that time, my husband's father committed suicide. And so there was a lot of grief there as well. And I can remember, do you remember Chris Baum?
Yeah.
I'm going to just give her the biggest shout out. She came up to me and she said, I would like to start giving you prenatal massages.
I remember she did that.
I remember, and I was like, I think that sounds lovely. And then after 2 or 3, she asked me, she was like, is this helping you? And I remember just breaking down crying and saying, I have so much grief in my body, even though I'm still living into this new thing. I just need someone else to love on me and this baby. Together, we can live into this next. And she was like, I'm here. I'm ready to love. I love you. And I was like, okay.
Wow. Okay. I mean, I have to circle back because you shared that Jared's father ended his life, and that is an enormity. So, and I have a sister who ended her life, and
I didn't know that, Erin.
That was in 2014. It's one of the things I noticed. I don't know if we talked about this. It gets very difficult to remember specificity of dates.
Yes.
Around death of people that are close to you. So like I can't tell you the exact date she died. And I have looked it up so many times, and I would think people think that was weird, but it just is. I've stopped beating myself up about it. So I want to say I am continuously saddened and amazed how many people I know have known somebody directly who has ended their life. And that's Jared's story to tell, and you're Erin. So, but I would imagine that does, because you have been married for some time and, a family unit of your own, that's incredibly impactful. And then Jared's a father now. So that's a lot. So whatever else you want to say, but I just have to acknowledge that because it's a profound loss.
It is. Speaking for myself, you're right. Jared has his own story, but speaking for myself, so he died 2 weeks after we announced that we were pregnant. And I had all of these ideas about what that time would look like. And I think that there was also a lot of grief about him not being there for these really important things and not being able to say that to him. It was really painful. And
I know that very well, that wanting somebody that you love to see certain things that they can't see now.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Can you say something? Okay, so I have been thinking about this morning, and part of it came from us talking a couple of days ago before this conversation.
Sure.
And it has to do with grief, but it has to do with something that I think is a close cousin of grief that we do not give enough of our attention to, which is disappointment. Grief is a word we kind of hear often, and I think many people associated with an event.
Sure.
Mostly and primarily the death of somebody you love. Now I think we're hearing it so much more in terms of the pandemic and grief around an immensity of death, but also death of many ways of us being in the world together.
That's right.
And disappointment's a connection to that too. And I'll add Brené's definition of it because that's what I utilize. Brené Brown's definition of disappointment is unmet expectations. Sometimes explicit expectations, sometimes not explicit. And acknowledge, part of it is acknowledging what it is we're disappointed by. And I had been thinking about this because you had said something in that conversation of, in this narrative, in this life, we don't always become the people we anticipate early on.
That's right.
So maybe that's a good way back into your story of where you were then and where you are now.
Yeah, I think that is. I mean, certainly disappointment was a defining characteristic throughout that story. A disappointment initially of not being a mother, and while publicly I might have said, "Oh, I don't know that I'll ever be a parent," there was a deep longing within me that I wanted to be. Then there was the disappointment of being pregnant, and then life looking very different as our family dealt with grief daily, right? The logistical pieces of just trying to figure out where my mother-in-law would live and what that looked like, along with what it would look like for my husband, who was having some of the best moments of his life around ordination and graduation.
Yeah, wow. Oh,
what would that look like for him? And having so much anger and feeling around that, so that I couldn't even really focus as much as I wanted to on the baby. But I will say that translates to now too, because I think, Ariane, we see these feelings all the time in society, and that they're coming out in really different ways, right? Like, we see the collective disappointment of our life together, people ending careers at the beginning of COVID in ways that they didn't want to end their careers, or people losing loved ones and not being able to be there at that when they wanted to be because of COVID, or weddings and didn't take place. All of this level of disappointment is connected to grief, and I think that that's something that we're all carrying with us, and our desire to figure out and define what life looks like now in this next phase of COVID. I think this has to be an important part of the conversation of naming it, so that as a community we can live into the new narrative together. Right?
You're saying too, this, what you said before, that we have to live our way into it.
Yeah.
And I quoted this in another conversation. It's Richard Rohr. You have to live your way into a new way of being.
That's
Sometimes
right.
I feel like our grief, we utilize the anger portion of grief because it's energizing.
Yes.
And it places something outside of ourselves because it's something we're angry at or someone we're angry with, as opposed to saying, this situation is like, we don't need to have a criticism of it or judge it. It just, this is the way it is.
Yeah.
So how can I live? How can I thrive? How can I move into what I want to do? And I don't know, sometimes is that connected just with accepting enoughness? Like, it's just, it's good enough.
I had a very real thing happen this week. Can I share what happened this week that really drove home this reality to me and my own internal grief about COVID? So, as you know, I just had COVID a second time. The first time I contracted COVID, it took me several months to get better, and now I'm in week 3 of getting recovering from COVID. And on Monday, I showed up to my staff meeting. I work at this great woman-led, faith-based consulting group, Vandersall Collective. I show up on my staff meeting at Zoom, and I looked the way that I felt. And my boss looked at me and said, "I think you need to go back to bed. I think you need to go back to bed." Now, I need to give a sideways turn here for one moment and say, I have been spending like the last 2 years, most of my writing, most of my theological reflection in my own work is all about like the colonization of our brains and the way that like stewardship is impacted, the ways that we think about money is impacted by this colonization. So, people are overworking because what is their life worth and all. So I am like knee deep in money narratives and really thinking that I've got a grasp on it, right? And really doing the internal work of my own life. So Monday, Mika, who is just amazing to work with. I really am grateful to have a colleague like her. She says, Erin, I think you need to go back to bed. In fact, I don't think you should just go back to bed. I'm going to take your meetings that you have for the next 3 days, because I think you continue to work and you're going to keep being sick and you have to take time to recover. So I agreed with her publicly. In the Vandersall Collective, folks that are listening will agree with me. I agreed with her publicly, right? I got off. I was all cheerful about it, like, whatever you say, Mika. And then later, I just went into like full on weeping, right? Full on tears and weeping area. And I texted her and I said, Mika, I'm really afraid of two things. And I said, I feel like we have a level of trust. I just need to name two things. One, I'm afraid that you are going to resent me, that I'm not at work, and that you're going to come to be frustrated at my weakness. And two, I'm afraid that you're going to see that you can do it without me and that you won't need me anymore. And I said, I'm trying really hard to live into my own new narratives. I recognize that, like, this is ironic that my own brain is colonized. I can't even get past this, but I'm having a really hard time not working and just taking the time I need to rest. And she called me and we had some really great conversations about what it means to do things differently.
Okay, we just have to stop for a second. So first of all, I'm getting teary-eyed because I can like resonate, I feel like, with this sense of failure, of being sick, as if sickness is a personal failing.
Yes.
Secondarily, if there's any way I can get this to the Brene Brown Collective, because literally this is one of the most amazing examples of courageous culture that I've ever heard of in a workplace. What you did was live into being completely vulnerable with the reality of taking care of yourself. And you brought that to your boss, your mentor, your colleague.
Yeah.
So that you could talk about this with her a little bit more. And you completely lived into engaged connection, which is Brené's whole next big theory at the end of Atlas of the Heart. It's all about, how do we cultivate meaningful connection? And doing that at work that's impressive, Erin. That's incredibly courageous that you did that.
Well, I appreciate the affirmation. I receive it. I'm going to receive the affirmation.
Receive it.
And I want to add on and say that I would only do that within a culture of trust.
Right. That's exactly right. And it builds more trust.
That's right. And I have not encountered a place quite like this where that was possible. It has taken active conversations that are courageous together. So I am grateful for Mika, for sure.
So can I ask one other question? Because I think you're saying something too that is really, and this is something like I want to talk about in these conversations, but it really hasn't come up till just now. So I have this tea towel that I bought. And I was visiting a friend in Louisville, Kentucky, and I bought this tea towel in a gift shop that says, why didn't somebody tell me that the hardest part about being an adult is trying to figure out what to fix for dinner every single night?
That's so true.
And I laughed out loud when I read this tea towel, because exactly right. That is so true. I hate being responsible for myself and for other people in making dinner. And it's never ending,
No.
So, and this, you have two young boys, because now I have a boy in my household every other week. And my God, the amount of food they eat is insane. They eat so much food. Anyway, that's another topic. Okay. But the towel also speaks to something that I think I have been spending at least the last, 15 years of my life working on, and will spend my whole life working on, which is taking care of myself as an adult, recognizing that I am the adult I am looking for. I am always the adult I'm looking for. And I always have this autonomy and power to care for myself. And that is so hard. I so understand wanting to go to work when you are sick in bed with COVID and COVID brain and fog and what it's doing to your body.
Yeah. And somewhere along the line, I think that I had internalized a message that, like, you have to work hard enough so that people will see you as worthy of love. Right? You have to work hard enough so that you are irreplaceable, so that you will earn your place in being remembered. And I think that also relates to a lot of what we've been experiencing culturally recently too, is like, as people are reflecting on their own mortality, right? As we've thought about the last 3 years and thinking about, like, what does it mean to make meaning of this time? What is my life even meant? Of course, we were seeing all kinds of job upheaval, et cetera. But I also think it's caused people also to double down on some of these narratives. Like they both can be true at this moment, right? We've got people saying it's not worth it. And then other people being like, oh no, I really need to make sure that like I am carving out my place so that I am remembered. Or
well, that's also about a control. I mean, that's about trying to control everything.
That's absolutely.
And again, grief reminds you have no control.
Yep. That's exactly right. It pulls
grief.
It out.
Yeah. Grief can remind you that you are the only adult in the world that can take care of you.
That's right.
Because, and again, that connects, I think, with the disappointment first of all, disappointing yourself with having that conversation with your boss, feeling the disappointment that you have towards your boss and your colleagues, and that you can't be exactly who you want to be and strive to be all the time.
Yeah. And disappointment in myself that like I couldn't will myself to be better. Right. Like I can't or disappointment, like somehow along the line, I've connected like moral choice to like my body ailment. Like maybe I've made some bad life choices that I am now sick, which obviously there's all sorts of things related to COVID and morality around how people perceive choices around vaccinations, et cetera. But apart from that, thinking about like, what did I do wrong? Maybe I was working too hard before. Maybe I didn't get enough exercise. Maybe I should have had that orange,
So what do you think? And you mentioned that you've done your therapy, you're doing your work. Yeah.
Feeling it.
Yeah. Me loving that work. I will always have that work. Where do you think, and, talk about this as you want to, where did the narrative come from?
Yeah, no, that's an important one. So I grew up in a culture of people that were farmers in central North Dakota. And my grandparents saved a lot of money for both of my parents to go to college. And there was a sense of like duty and upward mobility. And growing up, there was definitely a culture that like, I'm proud of you came before I love you.
Wow.
So, and we've worked a lot, I think, as a closer family to address some of that. I'm proud of the work that my parents and I have done together. I'm grateful for them, for all that they did for me. And at the same time, I grew up really recognizing my mom, highly accomplished woman, very much disconnected, for example, feeling with thinking because of gender roles, right? So in order to be a successful woman, Erin, you need to accomplish, you need to remain, logical thinking. We aren't inconsistent with our feelings. You put those aside, you keep on striving for achievement, you work harder than all the other men, right? Like these are the messages that I heard as a kid. And so I think a lot of my life, and one of the reasons why I love this podcast is this idea that, we cannot be fully human without integrating feeling with thinking, right? That God speaks deeply through our, I'm in the middle of continuing theological studies because I just love it. And I think it's important to keep learning. But like this shift away from like enlightenment thinking of like either thinking like knowledge for knowledge's sake alone, irrationality or moral action, giving way to like experiencing the vastness of the universe first, and then from there being able to process and think and live as more creatures in the world, right? That God speaks to us first through our intuition, through our bodies first. That has become part of my lifelong journey as an adult, is learning how to integrate feeling without apology for being a woman.
Okay, there's so much there. And you talked about the feeling and the body. And, I don't even think I had any sense of an embodied awareness for a long time because thinking and feeling were kept so distinct.
Yes.
And the idea that I could think my way through an emotion was also something
Me too.
My therapist had a lot of nice, quiet conversations with me while I tried to think my way through many emotions for years. I just talked and talked and talked.
I can process my way out of this.
That's
I know
exactly
right.
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
And then the awareness you have to allow or you accept, be disappointed by the embodied reality of your emotional self.
Yeah.
And you said something when you were talking about theological cellular that I don't fully understand, when you talked about the colonization of your brain in different ways. Can you say more about what that is? Because I don't think I know what that means.
So I'm happy to talk about it. So there are some wonderful thinkers in this field that I want to lift up because the ideas that I'm about to name are not my own. And so I think it's important to name who's been really feeding my ideas. But, Edgar Villanueva wrote a wonderful book about colonizing wealth, where he talks about, right, like we have all of these creation narratives around land and animals. And it was really when humans became farmers that we began to think about ideas about owning, right? So owning, instead of caring for, we started to own land, or we started to own our property. But then we all are very much aware, especially over the past few years, about the ways in which bodies have been owned, presumably, or the ways in which, like the wonderful author of The Body Is Not an Apology talks about how society has created a hierarchy of where some bodies were meant to be worth more. There's a cost to somebody, right? And the more you cost, the more you were worth, the more you were irreplaceable. And this was not just felt in those that were slaves, but those that, of course, were perpetuating these systems, right? So when we think about our own lives now, as we think about what bodies are worth, we see this all the time in the marketplace. We see people hustling. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics actually keeps what the average American's work hour is worth. So they factor in different regions and they factor in different jobs of specialization. It's right now at about $26 and some change, which is helpful, but they take that into account when they think about like cost benefit analysis around policies. So that's just like so deep in our lives, right? And it also becomes then part of this like idea of, what am I worth, right? Am I worth more if I make more money? Am I worth more if I have that child that I wanted? Am I worth more because I'm living into my vocation the way I thought I was? Like there's all of this that gets wrapped up into this conversation. And now I think connected to the grief of large scale death that we've just encountered and are continuing to encounter. Right? And then of course, I live in St. Paul where multiple, starting on the national scene with Philandro Castile, but it's certainly not stopping there. The deaths of people of color and what are their lives worth, and the cost is something that we're all thinking about.
Yeah, and it's a really challenging question in my institutional world, and even the idea of worth of the body. And I think, we often use the phrase, we're a church. Well, we're not a church is a building, we're a body of Christ, right? Well, what's the body of Christ worth? Is it worth different things in different congregational settings? And you talked about stewardship. You used that word earlier. I don't know if everybody knows what that means. And that's it's basically I would say it's the annual fundraising campaign that every congregation does to fund its operating expenses.
Yeah. Well, and I would also say we see this beyond the church. So, in charitable giving, there's now this term called philanthropic redlining that I think is important to name, where some lives that are being supported by some organizations, if they are led by people of color, there are a number of studies now that show people of color that lead nonprofit organizations are far less likely to receive the same amount of funding. And the funding they receive has different things that are attached to it, right?
Yeah, it's conditional.
So I think, for me, as I've been doing this work, I think that's part of the grief too, is recognizing this reality, this disappointment, the disappointment that this country isn't what I thought it was either, even though I thought I was in the know. The disappointment of my own complicity within it, even though I try and keep on doing my work as a white woman, it's still there, and there's much work to still do. So, yeah.
So how do you think acknowledging disappointment enables you to thrive and embody your life and the narrative you want to have?
I'm a deep introvert, right? I become even more introverted the older I get. I work alone from my home office, right? But I do believe in the importance of relationships and community. And I do believe in the importance of these conversations, of acknowledging the places where expectations haven't been met, either my own or others, showing up for the pain that causes, and naming it outright, I think is a holy act. And I think it's one that, frankly, if we were to look at a lot of biblical texts, we would see it throughout.
I was just thinking the same thing. That's
all
right.
sorts of lamentations happening.
Yeah, you know, Erin, I just got to say, it's like, I'm a little bit afraid to talk too much about Jesus and the Bible on this podcast. I've been, one of my fears is, I mean, it's twofold, and you're talking about being a woman too, and all the disparities and differences in that. And I don't really see someone like me out there talking about faith. And what do I mean by say me? I don't know, progressive, but I'm not super progressive, I wouldn't say, but liberal, intellectual. I can't even stand using all these labels, because then I'm going to, pigeonhole what I'm exactly looking for. Right. But what I see in the mainstream, and certainly the most popular, it's definitely men. Men are out there that talk about faith and are at the highest levels of talking about it. And that's great and fine. And I want to hear more from women and embodied women, and women bringing our lens into the conversation, especially around faith and Bible and Jesus, not just for people of faith, but also because most of us stew in some way in a faith-based culture. We are either born into households where it's a part of our life, it's culturally, communally part of our lives. And I get scared about, bringing it up too much on this podcast, because I'm like, I want people to listen to it and not think it's a churchy podcast or a scripture podcast. But I think you might agree, we don't do a great job around scripture. I mean, the scripture is all about feeling beings who think. I mean, the whole thing.
It totally is. I totally agree with you completely. And, your initial question, I was leading to the idea that, like, it's the community that holds me, and it's through the process of naming it. But I think you've just spoken a word of real challenge, I think, maybe to the both of us. And so I'm going to claim it, which is this. Which is, I think these kinds of conversations need to happen more publicly, where we are centering our own narrative in the interpretive lens of Scripture. We're centering our own narrative in a particular hermeneutic that is not one of colonialism, right? I think that there's a niche for that, away from, the celebrity Christian culture, right?
Yeah.
And away from the hustle. And I think what is dynamic about what you're doing, and I hope will continue, is that there's an active invitation, not for there to be like a sage on the stage,
right?
But to invite people into the conversation and say, hey, this has been my experience. What's been yours? And for us to claim together that we can talk about these things as women. I think there's a big need for that right now.
I think you would agree. I mean, it's Seminary, and ever since, I am amazed by the wisdom of other people. Like just everyday people. I mean, I can have incredible conversations with so many people, and we don't have enough of these types of conversations in the public space. Conversations are argumentative, and it's off-putting. And the scripture that informs so much of this for me is, and I don't think this is a paraphrase of some sort, knowledge puffs up, love builds up.
Oh, I love that.
And that's from Paul's letter somewhere. And to me, these are conversations that are building people up in love. I mean, the impetus for me, love in the sense of wanting to build people up. I mean, that's
right.
The point, and putting good things out there. Okay, so I'm sorry, and sun's coming right in my eyes. You've seen me shift my computer as I continuously navigate my new home and how to have my life. It's been fun to lots of practicing with anger and disappointment in that too. The joy of getting married, and then the anger and disappointment that you don't live in a castle and everything's exactly as you like.
Yeah, I totally get it. I know. Oh, and by the way, my new spouse, has laundry and all
those things.
I get it. I do.
Okay, you have a book coming out, I believe.
It came out.
Okay.
It came out.
Tell me what, just in closing, tell me, what are you doing? Let's talk about your incredible work and what you do.
Oh, that's nice. Thanks for the invitation. To do
Of
that.
course.
I wasn't expecting that. I'm like, wait, I have a book somewhere in there. It's over there. Yeah. You were talking about there being some really incredible people out there in which to have deep conversations. So last year, I worked with this wonderful practical theologian named Dustin Bennick, and we invited our friends and people that we really admire across fields, really very strategically across. He would use the word ecclesial ecology. I would say across different sectors and fields to really write about the experience of COVID, but where imagination allowed for new ways of caring for one another. And so here I talk about philanthropic redlining, what it means for judicatory bodies to be encountering people of color. We talk about the generosity of death. We talk a lot about the crisis of belonging. And so it's available, it's out there. And then from there, what we heard from people was that this language of the crisis of belonging is something that is really tracking. And so we, the two of us, along with 4 other people, Angela Gorell, who has got an excellent book out about joy, Eric Barreto, who's a New Testament scholar at Princeton, Christian Peel, who was at Riverside and at the White House, and Patrick Reyes, who wrote an amazing book that everybody should read about No One Cries When We Die. The 6 of us all came with different viewpoints about what belonging looks like and the crisis that we're encountering. For example, I am thinking a lot about the crisis of belonging when we're thinking about colonization of our minds.
Right.
So we all came together and we are about to put out a series of books to that end. So
wow.
Yeah, that's good.
I think we need to have a separate conversation on the crisis of belonging.
It's a huge, Angela Gorell was the first one to tell me, when we think about suicide, which you and I have encountered, it's one of 3 factors, right? About whether a person is feeling like they can continue in life is their sense of belonging in the world. So it's,
and even belonging to themselves,
belonging to their bodies. And then for Patrick Reyes, who talks about his experience of growing up as a migrant farmer, he's like, for the people that I live with, belonging is life or death. Like it's whether or not we eat, whether or not we don't. So yeah, we can have all the conversations you want.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yes, because I need to have more of this conversation, but I want to thank you for the time of this conversation. I'm already getting overwhelmed thinking about when I re-listen to this, because that's a gift I get to do, right? And making this, I get to listen to the conversation again, and then I'm like, oh, wow, right. So I'm very much looking forward to doing that with this conversation. And I'm really, really happy that we've reconnected because of this.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that is the whole point of the conversation that you and I were talking about, is this idea of we can't live into new narratives without this source of connection. And so I'm so grateful for the work that you're doing and grateful for our time together.
Thanks. And say hi to Jared for me.
No, I will.
I know. All right. Till next time, my friend.
Okay.
Bye
now.